All right, so good morning, welcome. It's the third day of the digital health webinar. You have already had the pleasure of seeing the presentations of my colleagues, Kim Rasha and Gustavo Hernandez. Today, the presentation will be a bit more focused on the sub-part of digital health that looks into artificial intelligence and machine learning and how you go about the validation of such medical devices. So my name is Stamatia Pagoulatou, and I would like to say a couple of words about myself before we start with the presentation. So I am a project associate at Medidee. I have been working at the company for a few months now. Before joining, I have, let's say, a background in mechanical engineering. I did my bachelor and master's in mechanical engineering in Greece. And then I came to Switzerland for my PhD, which was done in the EPFL in Lausanne, and specifically in the bioengineering field and the non-invasive cardiovascular monitoring field, so hemodynamics and cardiovascular technology. At Medidee, I am supporting clients with the clinical evaluation, particularly with an interest in digital health and the validation of software as medical device. You will see throughout the slides this acronym SAMD, which means software as medical device, and that includes as well machine learning powered or artificial intelligence powered medical device software. And additionally, I'm also supporting with verification and validation activities for software medical devices. So this is a couple of words about myself. Before we start the presentation, I would just like to let you know that these documents, because it will be shared with you at the end, along with the other presentations, as far as I know, it is prepared only for educational purposes and it cannot be used as a formal guidance to achieve compliance. As far as I know, you will be given access to the slides, provided that you will fill out the quiz that will be given to you at the end of this presentation. And you will also receive a certificate of attendance in such case that you complete the quiz. So in this presentation, we will discuss, we will say some introductory words on AI and machine learning, and particularly in their presence currently and the prospects for the future in the medical device industry. We will have an overview of the regulatory framework that is currently actually being built around software medical devices that incorporate AI and machine learning. That will concern both the EU and the USA. And finally, we will summarize, based on this regulatory framework, some key points on the validation of machine learning-based medical device software, with an emphasis on the clinical evaluation and data collection methodology. Before we start, I would just like to take this opportunity, because I know it is not as interactive to have a webinar than to be in person, and unfortunately due to COVID, this is how we have to go. But I would like to hear from you, understand better your background and your interest in this specific topic of discussion. So I will share some polls. First of all, it would be, I don't know if you can see the poll. Possibly you can. So I'm very interested to learn where you're actually coming from. So are you working in a startup? Are you in the academia world? Are you investors? I think you're able to see live the results of the poll. Okay. It's rather interesting. We have like equality, like a fair share of like almost 1/3 coming from startups, 1/3 from medium and large sized companies, and then a lot of people coming from academia, which is it's very interesting. I think we can close this poll. Another question that I would like to ask you. Let me see how I close this poll. Delete. Right. Is how familiar you are actually with the AI and machine learning. I don't know if you can see this poll now. Yeah, perfect, you can. Okay. Have 150 people participating today. And out of them, I would say the majority seems to have limited knowledge in these concepts, which is not a problem in this specific case because we will have some introduction into this, some basic introduction, honestly, to machine learning. Yeah, okay, it's perfect. And then a final question. I was wondering, in case you're already active in the medical device industry and you do have a product, a medical device, in which stage of the development are you currently in? So I saw before a lot of people are from the academia. Do you have maybe just a first concept in mind? Are you in the research and development phase? Are you doing clinical trials, or are you already CE marked? Mm-hmm. All right. So the majority of you are in this research and development phase, which is very interesting and I think very pertinent in this specific case because validation is the next step that you need to think about in the development process of a medical device. Okay, so thank you very much for your participation and for sharing your experience and background with us. I think it's rather it's rather interesting to see that there are so many different backgrounds and so many different people that are all interested in this question of validation of AI. I will discuss shortly these concepts and the presence of the AI in the medical device industry. Before doing so, and since this is the beginning of the presentation and it's the time where I have your focused attention, I would just like to let you know that you can make use of a free service that we provide at Medidee. So basically, this is a free regulatory and clinical checkup that entails basically a 1 hour free session with us where you can bring us your problems or your questions regarding the regulatory affairs for your device. And we offer our expertise with subject matter experts. So please do contact me after this, at the end of the webinar, in case you're interested in this free service. We have a limited number of spots, so it's going to be a first come, first serve basis. Okay, and now I think we are actually ready to start talking about AI and machine learning. So what is artificial intelligence and what is machine learning? If we look into the definition that is very often used within regulations and regulatory documents, basically the definition of John McCarthy is given, whereby the artificial intelligence is the science and engineering of making intelligent machines. So we can think of AI in the current, in the modern definition, as the study and design of intelligent agents, basically systems that perceive their environment and take actions which maximize their chances to succeed. So this is a generic term that addresses basically programs that can sense, reason, act, adapt. And within this generic, let's say, umbrella term, we have a branch which is called machine learning. So machine learning is a branch of AI which focuses on the use of data and algorithms to imitate the way humans learn. The idea is that you have a software, an algorithm that is getting exposed to data, and the more exposure it gets to data, the better its performance and its accuracy gets. So it improves by exposure to data over time. So this is the basic concept of machine learning. And then within machine learning, there are different categories of learning. Especially within the regulations, usually they refer to either supervised versus unsupervised learning. These are the two categories that are mostly focusing on. So if we take a quick look at what supervised learning and unsupervised learning is, with very basic, let's say, in very basic terms, the concept of supervised learning is that you have a software that is being trained using label data, and it is able, through this training process at the end, to map the input data into an output. For example, if you have let's say, an AI machine learning software that is working on image recognition, like recognizing images of dogs versus cats, the idea is that you're going to train your model, you're going to provide in the beginning of the process to the model in the development some images that are going to be labeled. This is an image of this animal and this is an image of the other. And then through these supervisions, through this training with label data, at the end, you will end up with a software that is able to classify your images. To the contrary of that, we have the concept of unsupervised learning, and the major difference here is the labeling of the input. Basically, during the development of such a model, of an unsupervised learning model, the idea is that you provide to the model data which are unlabeled, so it doesn't know if this specific image represents a dog or a cat. However, what the model is going to do is that it's going to learn basically patterns within the images, and then it will be able at the end of the development to cluster the data. It's not going to be able to tell you which animal is which, but it's going to be able to tell you that there is a difference between these two images. So this is the concept of supervised and unsupervised learning. Now, let's look into the presence of such machine learning enabled medical devices. We will focus in the US because we have actually been provided by the FDA a nice list of devices that have currently being that are approved by the FDA and that use machine learning. You can also look into this list. I have the website in this slide, and if we go into this website, we will see that there are approximately 343 devices that have been approved by the FDA up to 2021, which is a rather big number, I would say. Now, if we do some more analysis into this data, I think it will become quite obvious why we're having this conversation today and why so many of you are actually interested in this topic. It is very interesting to see that, okay, in terms of application, it seems that a lot of these devices are focused on radiology. So approximately 70% of this data, these devices that have been approved by the FDA, are in the field of radiology, and then some are in 12% are in cardiovascular applications, cardiology, and then a few are in other fields such as hematology, neurology, etc. Now, the most interesting data we can extract from this list is the trend in the approval of such devices. And what we will see is that between 1997 to 2000 and 2015, there were less than 30 approvals, whereas in 2020 alone, there were approximately 100 approvals. I think this goes to show exactly this increased interest in artificial intelligence and its application in the healthcare system nowadays. And it is actually, the forecasts say that these numbers are expected to continuously increase as more and more applications are coming into light for machine learning. And basically, more disease areas are starting to being investigated. I have two examples of devices that have been approved by the FDA, and these examples are actually of great interest. One is the IDXDR. I don't know if you have heard of this software. Basically, the idea here is that you have a machine learning, deep learning actually, based software, which is able to provide a screening decision for an eye disease, which is called diabetic retinopathy. And how does it do that? Basically, you have the input, which is an ophthalmic image captured with a fundus camera, what we call fundoscopy. And then the deep learning model, it is able to recognize, it is able to classify the images into more than mild diabetic retinopathy, or let's say small chances of having the disease. So this device, which was actually cleared in 2018, and it claims to be the first autonomous AI system that has been cleared. By the way, if you have any questions, keep in mind that you can reach out in the chat. I will be taking a look. So far, I think we don't have anything, but Linda is also taking care of that. Okay, so that was one example, and a second example, which I think is also a very interesting technology. It's the caption guidance, which has also been cleared by the FDA in 2020. And the idea here is that you have a system that is able to guide a previously untrained user through the process of cardiac ultrasound. So basically, the idea here is that it would be nice to have untrained professionals, such as nurses who have no special training in sonography, and provide them with such with an ultrasound and this software, so that the software is able to guide them through the process and to capture the acceptably, let's say, the good quality images. So these are two interesting examples of devices that we're going to follow throughout the presentation. And I mean, before we start looking into the regulatory framework, I think if we discuss benefits and risks, in terms of benefits, I'm sure you can think of many potential advantages to having AI into the medical world. You have a machine that has no downtime. It never stops, so you can save time, you can save resources, you can automate tasks. You're able maybe to identify trends that might be invisible even to an expert healthcare professional, and you facilitate decision making. Many advantages. I'm sure you can think a lot more than that as well. Now, in terms of risks, there are many pitfalls and many challenges to AI in the healthcare system. And some of these you have already seen in the previous presentations, right? You discussed with Gustavo the concept of cybersecurity and how these systems are susceptible to security risks, and how luring, how interesting it is for hackers to actually get access to the medical healthcare system. So one potential risk would be cybersecurity. Another potential risk is the fact that you have an AI, you have, let's say, people have huge biases too. It's correct. You have an AI that might be overlooking social variables, right? You have an AI that might have been trained in a specific subpopulation, therefore it is not generalizable, right? The performance is dependent on data quantity and quality, and this is something that is very important and comes heavily into regulating these devices. And overall, these various risks and pitfalls, I would say, they contribute to a general mistrust from the medical community. And it's actually a pivotal point of importance. And the regulations, they very much focus on this. How do you make an AI system that is actually transparent and explainable to a point that the patient and the doctor will be able to trust it and will listen to it eventually? You might have the best system, but if the medical doctor disregards it because he doesn't understand it, then it's not really important. So we have a question. In the current medical devices, is the model part of the device software, or are only parameters extracted from the model? I'm not sure I understand this question. So in the current medical devices, is the model part of the device software, or are only parameters extracted from the model? If you could clarify what you mean with this question, it would be great, Stefan. What about privacy and preserving personal data? Of course, a very important risk, and we will actually get to this point shortly. So we will discuss privacy and personal data. And then for the question of Stefan, if you can just give me some more hints as to what you are referring to. Okay, so we'll get back to this question shortly. Now, with all of these points that we've discussed, I think it is safe to say that AI, machine learning-based software medical devices pose an important challenge to regulators. Why is that? Well, first of all, let's see why they differ from other medical technologies. First of all, they have the capability to continuously learn, right? So you have, let's say, a machine learning algorithm that has been trained on a certain amount of data and now is able to make some predictions. As you continue gathering data, you're able to retrain your model. And with this retraining process, you hope to get better performance, which is usually the case. So you have this potential, and it's actually the power of AI, that the more you want to continuously learn, you want to get more data for training in order to improve performance and accuracy, right? So but this goes against the typical paradigm of regulations, right? Regulatory frameworks, they are very stiff. You need to get a conformity assessment that demonstrates the safety and the performance of the device, and it's very difficult to accept changes without having some sort of a second conformity reassessment and reapproval. So first of all, it's this capability to continuously learn that poses that is essentially different from other technologies, and that poses extra challenges to regulators. The fact that they have the potential to become ubiquitous in the medical world and to give recommendations. So you have systems as the one we saw before that are able to make a diagnosis or to give access to untrained professionals to diagnose, to conduct some procedures which were otherwise requiring some expertise. So this feature or trait of having an autonomous system, it's something that's rather different than other medical technologies. And then the last point is what we discussed of the concept of trust. You have a system in front of you that makes recommendations which are often opaque to the physician. So the physician does not understand how the AI reached this conclusion. So, in summary, basically, the challenges, they come from the fact that you might have a performance of an AI system that has been tested in a specific environment, but the fact is that it might not be performing the same way in an actual setting. So maybe you have a potential biases coming from over extrapolation, from small samples, etc. You have adaptive systems that change, and then also you have the human factors and the interaction with the environment. And actually, to give you an example of how important that is and how much you need to consider this in your validation process, we have the cautionary tale of the computer-aided detection CAD for mammography. So basically, this is a technology that was heavily promoted and invested in the early 2000s, and it is a way to basically improve breast cancer detection. So you have an automated system that is able to contribute to the diagnosis of breast cancer. And this system, although it might be performing well, it was actually shown in a study that was published in JAMA that exactly because of the interaction between the physicians and the software, so the way that the physicians were able to interact and understand the software, the overall performance was not better. In the end, the cancer detection rates did not improve, and in some cases, they might have been worse. So human factors engineering is a point of pivotal importance. So we have another question. Isn't continuously learning of AI in the field not allowed at the moment? Only locked AI is possible to be deployed at the moment, or is this not? Have you examples of continuously learning AI deployed in the clinical practice? So this is a very interesting question. And we're going to discuss this right now, actually, because we're going to go into the regulatory framework around AI locked and adaptive models. To answer the question, at the current moment, the FDA and in the US, we have only locked AI models that have been approved. However, it is interesting to see that the two examples I showed before, so basically the IDX DR and the caption guidance, they have come with a predetermined change control plan. They have in the if we see the basically the device description from the de novo application in the FDA, it says for the IDXDR that it is actually an adaptive AI model. It's not clear whether at this point there has been changes. However, let's say there is this potential in the future. But we will discuss this exactly right now as we're going to go into this topic of the regulatory framework of AI machine learning based software medical devices. And we will start looking actually into the US first, because we have, it's true that the important discussions on how you go about regulating AI machine learning software started from the FDA. And it started with the white paper that was published in 2019. It's actually a proposal for a regulatory framework exactly for modifications to AI ML based software as medical device. So in this proposal, in this white paper, first of all, they follow a risk-based approach based on the IMTRF risk categorization. The idea is that the higher the risk of the device, the higher the scrutiny you're going to get for the for conformity assessment, for evaluating the effectiveness of the device and the safety. And this risk-based approach is basically looking into two characteristics. So it looks at the significance of the information the device is providing to the healthcare decision making. So do you have a device that is actually used to help diagnosis or treatment, then you're possibly a high risk class device. And then the second parameter is the state of the health of the patient. So is the patient actually healthy, or is he in a critical position state? So according to the scheme, you have the risk of the device. I think Kim also discussed a bit risk classification, if I'm not mistaken. In any case, there is this reference to the risk-based approach within this white paper of the FDA. And then there is this distinction between locked and adaptive AI, which is basically it's complementing the question that we had from Nelle. So just to be on the same page, because I saw some people, they are not very familiar with AI. Basically, there is a definition of what locked AI and adaptive AI is. And I think instinctively, intuitively, you can already imagine that locked AI refers basically to algorithms that provide always the same result each time the same input is used. Let's say that they are frozen algorithms. And to the contrary of that, we have the adaptive AI systems, which have the ability to continuously learn, therefore leveraging the power of AI, the complete power of AI to improve its performance as more data are gathered. Now, for changes in locked models, it's clear that the algorithm actually needs to require, it will require FDA pre-market review. To the contrary, for adaptive AI, for continuously learning AI, the FDA actually comes up with a proposal within this white paper that is for change management, and it's following the total product life cycle approach. So there are 4 steps to this proposal for change management. And the very first one, it refers to establishing clear expectations on quality systems and good machine learning practices. So it should be clear that the AI that you are developing, it follows good machine learning practices, and these good machine learning practices are also followed throughout the total product life cycle, i.e., when you're also implementing changes. So, and we will get back to this point of good machine learning practices and what that might entail. The second part, the second step, it would be that you need, of course, to demonstrate reasonable assurance of the safety and the effectiveness of the device. And you actually need to demonstrate that you will be able to continuously manage patient risks throughout the life cycle of the device. And this actually goes to the concept of having a predetermined change control plan. So the proposal of the FDA with respect to managing changes says that you need, for the initial pre-market review, to have a predetermined change control plan that will include 2 basic components. The first component is called the software as medical device pre-specification. And then the second one is the algorithm change protocol. Basically, you need to answer questions on what and how. So with pre-specifications, you're explaining what will be changing. Are you going to be maybe modifying the performance by retraining your algorithm? Are you going to be changing the inputs? Are you going to be changing the intended use? Whereas with the how question, with the algorithm change protocol, you're explaining how this will be implemented methodologically. Now, the third step is that throughout this process, you need to consider, of course, risk management approaches in development, validation, and during the execution of these algorithm changes. So it's not that you have had the pre-market approval, your device is on the market, and then your risk management stops. To the contrary, because you're implementing changes, it's a lot more important to actually monitor the real world performance. And this is actually point number 4. You are supposed to continuously verify the safety and effectiveness of the device with real world performance data. And you should be able to increase the transparency to users. Okay. And then we can see this a schematic of this concept we just described, which basically starts with the model training and tuning and the validation of the model. And then for pre-market review, you have the first, let's say, assurance of the effectiveness and safety of the device, and then the also review of the predetermined change control plan. With the deployment of the model, you're starting to monitoring its performance in the real world, and by collection of this data, you come back actually to the development and validation phase, whereby good machine learning practices need to be considered. So following this white paper, actually, there were some initiatives by the FDA, some talks, and last year, in 2021, the FDA published the action plan for artificial intelligence machine learning-based software medical devices. And within this action plan, the FDA basically proposes the regulatory framework for regulating both locked and unlocked adaptive software. And to a great extent, this action plan, it actually follows the white paper that was previously published. And from the FDA side, there is a list of the intended actions and goals. And within these intended actions, there is the promise of the issuance of the draft guidance on the predetermined change control plan. There is the promise of encouraging the harmonization, the harmonized development of good machine learning practice. We will discuss this point shortly. There is again a discussion, an emphasis on the transparency of these devices to the user and to the doctor, to the patient. Supports with the respect to the development of methodologies to evaluate actually machine learning practices, including identifying and eliminating biases, basically to be able to understand if the development and validation process has followed sound methods with respect to potential biases, to the robustness, to the resilience of the algorithms with changes that will be implemented. And then again, a final point on real world performance. There is obviously a lot of stress from the FDA to the fact that there should be a plan for monitoring the real world performance in order to generate evidence that could reassure or confirm the continuous performance and safety of the device. Interestingly, in this, this goes also to the question that was asked before. Interestingly, within this action plan, the FDA recognizes that the caption guidance software that we saw in the beginning of the presentation, it actually was cleared with a predetermined change control plan to allow for the incorporation of future modifications. The FDA does not provide any further guidance as to what was actually given. However, it is interesting to see that these practices, they already start to being implemented. We spoke before for good machine learning practices. And on that point, we don't have yet some solid basis into what regulators expect. However, we have from the FDA, from Canada and the UK, a document that underlines 10 principles that should guide the development of good machine learning practices, and we will take a look into that currently now. So basically, the 10 principles for good machine learning practices, they start with having a multidisciplinary expertise throughout the total product life cycle. So basically, the idea here is that you need to have in-depth understanding of where your medical device will enter the clinical workflow, and especially what clinically important need will be addressed by the device. The second point is on good software engineering and security practices that need to be implemented. Basically, this is calling out to the basics, to the fundamentals. You need to have proper data quality assurance, data management, security. So this point of cybersecurity comes up again, and throughout this the total product life cycle, you are expected to follow the risk management approach. The third point is the clinical study participants and datasets should be representative of the intended patient population. I think this is rather intuitive. You are expected to have trained and validated your model in a way that you are covering the intended patient population, taking into consideration various aspects such as gender, ethnicity. This is particularly important, especially for the FDA, age, etc. The fourth point, I think it's very interesting, and it's something that, from my experience, I've seen it's not super clear, but you are expected to have a different training dataset and a test dataset. They should be independent, and they should ideally also reflect different, they should ideally come from different centers. I'm sure that you can imagine how you can have biases coming into play when you are validating a method with, I don't know, cross validation. These practices are not going to fly by any notified body or the FDA. So you're expected to have a separate test set and a training data set. The fifth point, it talks about what you have as a reference actually into your model. So how are you labeling your data? Selected reference data sets should be based upon the best available methods. So, for example, if you have a device that has a radiological application, you should consider what the gold standard method is for the diagnosis of a specific disease. And your data should reflect, your reference data should reflect this gold standard, be it, I don't know, X-ray, radiography. The sixth point, model design should be tailored to the available data and should reflect the intended use of the device. You are expected, therefore, to have some means for active mitigation of risks, such as overfitting, underfitting, performance degradation, security risks, etc. So considerations basically on the performance of the model, the appropriateness of the model, the intended, within the context of the intended purpose of the device. Point 7 is what we have been discussing from the very beginning, that the focus should be placed on the performance of the interaction between the human and the AI. So human factors consideration and interpretability. How can the human understand and interpret the results of the AI system? Point 8, testing should demonstrate the device performance using clinically relevant conditions. I think this is something very straightforward and something well known in general for the validation of any software medical device. Users should be provided clear and essential information as well. This is something that you in any medical device you can come across. I mean, there should be some pertinent information on the intended use, indications for use, what is the performance of the model for various maybe subgroups, if you have any specifically for AI characteristics with respect to the training of the model and the testing of the model, etc. And then finally, deployed models should be monitored for performance and retraining risks, which goes back to the very first point on the change management. So concerning industry standard, since scaffold X validation is gold standard, is this really not allowed? So the point is that with respect to the development, to the training of your model and understanding the performance, you can look cross-validation as a part of the model development. When it comes to the clinical evaluation of your device, so when it comes to the point of validation of your software, then it would not be acceptable to consider cross-validation. I hope this actually covers completely this question. So basically, sure, it is a gold standard, K-fold cross-validation. You can use it for the model development, however, not for the validation. Okay, there have been, I think, a few questions that I have missed, but I think I could maybe take some pause once I have completed the part on a regulatory framework to go through them, if this makes sense. Okay, I will continue a bit more and then I will get back to your questions shortly. So like this, basically we are closing the chapter on US and the FDA and what we have from that side regarding machine learning, change control management, good machine learning practices, etc. Let's go into the EU. And here I think you will agree with me and realize that in the EU we have only very recently started discussing these topics. We currently don't have any sort of guidance as to what is the acceptable, let's say, procedure of validating AI. However, there are some documents that can be followed and that have in any case started this discussion and have put maybe some pressure into developing frameworks and guidance documents. Already from the European Commission, there was the proposal of the Artificial Intelligence Act, which was published in 2021. The idea was to fill the regulatory void with respect to AI and to guarantee the safety and the performance of AI devices in general across the EU. Specifically with respect to medical devices, we can understand that according to the risk-based approach that is set out in this act, in the Artificial Intelligence Act, most healthcare AI applications would generally be considered high-risk category. And in these, for these devices, regulatory approval would in general need to fulfill various criteria, which have been already discussed also from within this presentation and from the FDA. Basically, you need to have adequate risk assessment, high quality data sets that are actually being fed into the system in order to reduce risks, right? So you want to have data that are reliable and representative. You need to have a proper documentation that can be assessed by authorities, clear information to the user, robustness, security, etc. So nothing really new here. The proposed regulation should rely on anonymized or pseudo-anonymized or encrypted patient data. Now, some more insight we actually get from the paper that was published by COCIR. COCIR is the European Coordination Committee of Radiological, Electromedical, and Healthcare IT industry. There was a paper that was published by them, if I remember well, in 2019, the first one, and then it was updated last year, May 2021. And it actually discusses the various characteristics of AI which are regulatory for, which are relevant for regulatory discussions, including also the change management question and how you go about adaptive AI. So similarly to the FDA, there is the definition of the predetermined change. Basically, this reflects an adaptation, refinement, or calibration of the device, which should follow a preset boundary. So basically, you are expected to have a predetermined algorithm change protocol, which should be submitted as part of your technical documentation, and it should exactly define what sort of changes are within the boundaries, and therefore they are approved, or which are out of scope, and therefore should require the involvement of notified bodies. Of course, for locked AI, again, any significant change entails reassessment. Some key points on AI regulation are discussed within this paper. One is on the controllability and the human oversight. Basically, controllability refers to the ability of an external operator to intervene or to deactivate an AI system, thereby enhancing basically the safety of the procedure. And there is a dedicated section again on transparency and explicability. The major aim behind focusing on this point is to gain user trust, as we discussed, basically to be able to better integrate your device into the clinical workflow and to assure that it is well perceived and adopted as a practice by the healthcare professionals. So that's one point. Then also to clarify liability, right? So if you have a system that is transparent, then you're also able to pinpoint where the mistake has been made in any situation that is precarious. So was it a user mistake? Was it an AI mistake? Or maybe a cybersecurity problem? And additionally, having a system that has increased transparency can also aid actually the manufacturer and the developer of the device, in that they are able to maybe better determine operating parameters or to debug their system and pinpoint potential sources of bias. Sorry. So again, with this discussion on transparency, we go to this topic of trust. And although we don't have a specific requirement from the EU, from the MDR, on having devices that are transparent, we do have certain elements that should be met as per MDR that can enhance trust. And of course, these refer to the performance, demonstrating the performance, the safety of the device, the security, especially for anything that has to do with IT, healthcare systems, eliminating risk errors, usability, right, repeatability or reproducibility for AI, and minimization of bias. So within the MDR, let's say we do have some points that can have implications for AI. And then a final white paper I would like to discuss with you is from the BSI, actually. So it's nice to see that there is also some interest from notified bodies to go into the discussion of how you're regulating AI devices, how you are able to validate them, and how basically from their side what they're expected to do in order to make sure that safe devices are on the European market. So basically within this paper, there are recommendations that are provided for developing essentially harmonized standards and regulations to govern medical devices in machine learning. And within this white paper, there is again a distinction between locked and continuous AI model. We have discussed this point extensively. There is a focus on the competence, trust, and reliability. Again, so same concepts coming up. Focus on data management with emphasis on data quality and bias. Some brief discussion into applicable standards that do not fully cover all questions regarding AI, but it would be 100% expected for any software medical device to follow the state of the art, and that could entail following the IEC 62304 on software lifecycle practices and the IEC 82304-1 requirements for safety and security of health systems. There is a reference to the change management, the FDA White Paper, and they also lay out some pertinent questions for AI validation, specifically with respect to data quality and bias. The white paper recognizes that you can have two sources basically of two elements that can impact data quality. One of them refers to the data set, the training data set itself, and one to the model. So basically both of these components have to be taken into consideration to delineate the data quality. And then various aspects that could be contributing to data quality is having a training data set that is complete, correct, appropriate for the specific intended purpose. It's consistent with respect to labeling and does not incorporate any bias. And then with respect to bias, it is obvious that if there is any bias within the data set, then this will actually perform the machine learning system. So think of all of the sources of bias that can be impacting your system. And we will discuss this point actually at a later stage. And then again, this concept of the continual assurance of the safety and performance across the life cycle. So we are basically concluding the discussion on the regulatory framework around the AI validation. I think you will agree with me that, I mean, some first steps towards this direction are taken. However, we're very far away from having a concrete guidance in front of us that can allow us to say, this is what an acceptable practice is with respect to good machine learning. This is how you exactly go about validating your AI. However, there is the promise that soon we will have concrete guidance. Already from the topics we have discussed, I think there are some points to consider with respect to clinical evaluation, and we will see this shortly. Just want to take a quick look at the questions that are left. So one question says, by Mo, to my understanding, adaptive AI does not necessarily mean continuously improving accuracy. So with more data, more models will be developed, then accuracy will become like a stock market. Today, the accuracy of the device is 90%. Tomorrow, it's 50%. This is very risky. Who will be held liable? Would you please clarify? So this is a very important point. And this is exactly the concept of having a predetermined change control plan. Because within this plan, you are expected to have, we said that you need to have reproducible AI systems, which means what? If you have a system that is continuously learning, then obviously you cannot predict how for the same input it will react, but you can set a minimum requirement of performance. So the idea would be that you are requested to, once you are actually changing your device, to monitor the performance and to make sure that you're either staying stable in terms of performance or you're improving. Otherwise, this raises, of course, red flags, right? So you are expected within the predetermined change control plan, as explained by the FDA, and as will possibly be the case here, to have this assurance of a minimum performance. I hope this answers your question. Thank you. Is COCIR a legalization considered a must harmonized, recognized in the EU? No. So basically, what we have here is a proposal from the EU side. Currently, we do not have a firm legal framework around validation of AI. Obviously, the state of the art can be taken into consideration, and obviously, while you are drafting your clinical evaluation, you can refer both to the FDA papers, both to the to any sort of state-of-the-art document that there is out there. However, formal guidance is not currently available. There is a formal guidance with respect to the clinical evaluation of software as medical device, not incorporating per se artificial machine learning and the concept of continuous learning. We will see this exactly afterwards, now that we're going to be discussing about clinical evaluation. Okay. Should this monitoring, by Nella, this question, should this monitoring of online learning AI be done on the test set or on real world data coming from the clinic? So you're monitoring the performance of the AI throughout the product life cycle. So you're monitoring the performance of the AI in the real world. And this is actually important information, as the testing environment is never, well, it is indicative, but you are expected to very closely monitor AI, especially in the case of adaptive learning. However, in terms of monitoring the performance of the test set, of course, once you are implementing changes, you need, as we discussed before, you need to make sure that you have at least a minimum, you're meeting a minimum set of requirements, which will be discussed and which will be agreed with a notified body, I suppose, at some point, or with the FDA once you go for the initial assessment. If you are not able to meet this minimum performance, then it's a problem, and then this has to be communicated, right? Okay, I hope this answers your question, Nella. Is there anything to note from the FDA AI workshop from October 14, 2020? So actually, I did not include this in the presentation, but it is a very interesting point. So there was a dedicated workshop, a dedicated day, or if I remember well, it was 4 hours on this specific topic by the FDA. I did not include it in the presentation because I think most of the points that were discussed in this occasion are already covered to some extent. So basically, if we look into the content of this webinar, there was a lot of discussion on the trust, and that was coming from both regulators and healthcare practitioners, as well as patients, actually, who were saying, I don't want an AI to make decisions for my life. And I mean, this is a very valid point. And it's, I think, the point that you need to address during your within your technical documentation. So there was a lot of, it was basically focused mostly on transparency and this, how do you enhance trust? There was some discussion on reimbursement and costs. So basically, how do you go about deciding which ones to reimburse or not? Discussion again on bias, so basically quality assurance. How do you make sure that your AI is generalizable? is diverse, right? So the FDA is always very, very cautious about these sort of questions, making sure that you have a system that represents all of the ethnic groups, all of these maybe population subgroups. So I think that were the most fundamental aspects of this workshop. Okay. Who is fundamentally liable, e.g. for a wrong diagnosis by AI? The medical doctor, the user, or the manufacturer? I mean, this is a great question. And this is exactly what needs to be, I think, explained within a formal guidance. So I don't know the answer to your question. This is why, as said before, it is important to have transparency in order to be able to pinpoint, like to find liability. But then in case of a wrong diagnosis, I don't know if the manufacturer would be liable, actually, provided that you are also supposed to have some sort of human oversight and controllability. It's what we said before, right? You're expecting to have, if you have a human in the loop who is expected to intervene and deactivate the AI, and it's a very tricky question, and I'm not sure how to go about it, but we definitely need some guidance. I mean, it's not my opinion on the topic. It's something that needs to be, and it is discussed heavily by the FDA. For example, in the workshop, there was discussion exactly on transparency and liability. So yeah, no answer to this question yet. The recording to the FDA AI workshop, that's great. Thanks, Scott. There are conditions that are a question by Enea. How do I highlight? Like this, right? Answer live. There are conditions that are proven to be not race-specific. In that case, do we still need to provide a data set which covers the whole population? Would the data set be considered biased? Okay, so a few thoughts on that question. First of all, in general, within your clinical evaluation of the medical device, you are expected to establish the state of the art. So if a condition has some race-specific, let's say, traits or not, should be clear from the state of the art. Now, if you have the state of the art to back you up with respect to the fact that there might be no race-specific differences, then in Europe, you can build an argumentation around that. In the FDA, you can try to build, I suppose, argumentation around that. My experience and what I know in this field is that this is like the low-hanging fruit from the FDA. It's high likely that it's not going to pass. They are very, very sensitive with respect to having a population that covers the entire spectrum of ethnicities in the US. And not only that, ethnicity, demographics such as age, BMIs, this can also come into play. So the very first thing to do to respond to this question is to establish the state of the art, find potential confounding factors from the state of the art. So what does the literature say in the topic? If you can build a strong documentation, do so, and in the EU, it might work. And I mean, try to argue this with the FDA and see where it takes you. However, I would not be very optimistic on that point. Okay, I hope this covered your question. Wait, okay, so this question was posted twice, right? So this was also covered. What's going on? Okay. Okay, perfect. If you do not mind, I would like to move on a bit with the presentation to make sure that we actually complete all slides, and then we can keep some time at the end to discuss all of your points. Okay, clinical evaluation of software as medical device. Let's go into some practical now aspects of of validating your device, provided that, as we said, the regulatory framework currently is evolving, and there is not like formal guidance yet to AI. What does validation of an AI machine learning based software medical device entail? Well, from the EU side, that would lead us to the MDR, right? And in the MDR Annex 1, we have the general safety and performance requirements, and specifically the GSPRs number 1 and 8 explain, well, this is a paraphrasis, but they explain that your device needs to be designed in a way that it is suitable for its intended purpose. So it meets its intended purpose, it is safe and effective, and shall not compromise the safety of patients or users. It is associated with risks which are acceptable if they are weighted against the benefits, and this is also pretty much what you have in GSPR number 8. So again, the benefit-risk ratio basically is positive. So all of these points, they lead to the to drafting a clinical evaluation that is trying to demonstrate that the device meets its intended purpose, it is safe and effective, it meets GSPRs number 1 and 8, and its benefits, as defined by the MDR, they outweigh the risks that will be identified by you via the risk analysis and via this process of clinical evaluation. We have more or less a similar approach from the FDA. Basically, software validation refers to establishing by objective evidence that software specifications conform to user need and intended uses. So pretty much the same sort of idea of demonstrating safety and performance for a specific in the context of a specific intended purpose, and taking into consideration user needs, taking into consideration the interaction between the device with the human, etc. In other words, basically the validation of any medical device requires a clinical evaluation. I'm sure that all of you who are currently in the research and development phase and beyond in medical devices, you are aware of this documentation. You are expected to produce a clinical evaluation that will address all of these points, and particularly for the case of software as medical device, not AI machine learning based, but in general software as medical device, we have a guidance document, as I briefly mentioned before, that can be consulted. So basically, this is there is one both in the FDA and in EU. I mean, they overlap to a great extent, actually. So in Europe, we will see the one from Europe, but the same principles are also respected in the US. We have the MDCG 2020-1, which is a guidance document on the clinical evaluation or performance evaluation, if it is an in vitro diagnostic, of software. And within this guidance document, which I would say in general it's a rather clear in terms of content, it's a rather straightforward methodology for validating software medical devices. There are 3 pillars going to be contributing to the clinical evaluation of software. So let's take a look into that. We have the very first pillar, which is the valid clinical association. So what is the valid clinical association? Basically, it answers the following question. Is there an association that is clinically accepted between your software medical device output and the target clinical condition? In other words, basically, the valid clinical association seeks to establish that there are sound scientific principles behind the use of your medical device software. Let me give you an example, and this example it actually comes from the guidance. Imagine you have a medical device software that is supposed to detect some heart anomalies, maybe arrhythmia, from auscultation. So basically you have auscultation sounds, and from the auscultation sounds you have a system, a medical device software that detects arrhythmias. The valid clinical association essentially would refer to the association of heart sounds and arrhythmia, the target condition. Now, that being said, you need also to take into consideration that the output of your device, probability of arrhythmia, it comes as the result of the inputs, the sound, and the implemented algorithms. It might be, an AI system, right? Like, how likely it is. So essentially, when you're discussing the valid clinical association of your device, you're expected to explain why the output of your software, which will be the outcome of the input and the implemented algorithm, will actually have an association with the target disease or with a specific value that you want to quantify. So this is the valid clinical association. Actually, we will also have an example of that we will work together later on. Take into consideration that this valid clinical association needs to be well-grounded and accepted by the clinical community. Now, the second pillar, it's in the US, it's called analytical validation, and the same goes for IVDRs, for IVDs. For medical devices in Europe, it's called technical validation, but it's the same principle. And here it's more on the technical performance. So basically, you need to demonstrate the technical performance of your device. And what does this mean? It means that you need to demonstrate the ability of the medical device software to accurately, reliably, and precisely predict the output data based on the input data, like generate an output from the input data. And here, the approach, I think it's rather instinctive. The approach follows verification activities for software. For example, that could mean following basically the state of the art, e.g. Demonstrating that you're compliant with state-of-the-art standards such as IEC 62304, etc. The various verification activities for your software that demonstrate technical performance. And then the third point, it is actually on clinical validation. I think this is the most straightforward. Here, you're answering the question, does use of your software as medical device accurate, reliable, and precise output, as verified with the technical performance verification, achieve the intended purpose for the specific target population in the context of clinical care. So here you're answering questions regarding to, have I considered in my clinical validation the intended use, the target population, the intended user, the intended user environment, use conditions, etc. It's more of the demonstration of the clinical performance by potentially clinical investigations that you're running, by looking into literature data on your device, or if you're planning to claim equivalence, which I think for software as medical device, it's something I would not recommend, or I cannot really see how it would work. But the idea is that you have clinical data to back up the safety and the performance of your device within the context of its intended purpose. Okay, and now that we have seen these 3 points, I actually, yeah, I think it would be instructive to look at the example that we had before. So in the beginning of the presentation, we discussed the IDX-DR, remember, which was the first autonomous system that was approved, cleared by the FDA. So let me remind you, this is a device that basically takes as input fundus images, so images of the retina, which are taken by a fundus camera. This is called fundoscopy. And then this input data, they are basically treated, or how should I say this, processed by a deep learning algorithm, which as an output gives a probability of having high or low chances of having diabetic retinopathy. So for this specific system, I would like you to take a few minutes. I think it's an interesting exercise to think of how you would go about demonstrating that there is a valid clinical association based on MDCG 2020-1, how you would go about the technical performance and the clinical performance demonstration for the device. So I would like to give you just a few minutes. Unfortunately, we cannot have something interactive where you respond, because that would be a bit chaotic. But I think it is interesting for you to take your time a bit before I go into this topic. So I'm going to give a few minutes for that. By the way, I see one question from Yael before on the predetermined change control plan and whether this is already implemented. As I told you, we don't have formal guidance. I mean, there is not a formal guidance from the FDA, but there is one device that, as mentioned by the FDA, that has been approved with the predetermined change control plan. So, I mean, can finish answering this. Okay, maybe I can go back to the... Yeah. Okay, I can continue maybe, and then there are a couple more questions I think left unanswered. Can go back to them. So I hope you all had time to think of this exercise. So valid clinical association, we explained before what the concept is. You want to demonstrate that the software output as a function of the input and the implemented algorithm is associated with a target disease. So if we break down these concepts for this specific device, that would mean, well, first of all, what is the output, the probability of having the disease? What is the input, the fundus images? What is the implemented algorithm? A state-of-the-art neural network, and the target disease is diabetic retinopathy. So valid clinical association basically would be demonstrating by establishing the state of the art, which we discussed before. Within your clinical evaluation, you need to demonstrate at least that your device performs at the state of the art level. And to do that, you are expected to have a literature search, which is another topic of discussion, which has to be thorough, reproducible, etc. And then in this literature, which reflects the latest state of the art on the topic, you are expected to find information, and you will probably do find information associating the fundus images, so ophthalmic images of the retina, with the diabetic retinopathy, the target condition. Now, should this not be something clinically accepted? So if you don't actually find anything in the literature on this association, because maybe you have a very novel concept, or because maybe I think for most cases that the state of the art should be covering the valid clinical association. But should this evidence not be enough, then keep in mind that within the MDCG 2020-1, it is recognized that evidence of the valid clinical association may also be provided and supplemented by the manufacturer's own clinical data. So if you have clinical data that demonstrate this valid clinical association, you can leverage them and you can use them to demonstrate this point. Why the state-of-the-art constraint? Is state-of-the-art well-defined? Why the state-of-the-art constraint? I mean, this is coming directly from the regulations. You are expected to have a device that meets the state-of-the-art at least. So you need to meet the state-of-the-art performance. And in your clinical evaluation, when you are establishing the state-of-the-art and you're explaining the literature behind the specific medical field concerned by your device, you're supposed to explain if there are similar devices to yours. So basically, what is their performance, what is their safety. So you need to have actually some reference as to what an acceptable performance and safety is for your device. So the state of the art is actually an important part of the clinical evaluation. And with the MDR, we are seeing that there is even more focus and even more requirements by notified bodies on this topic. So within your state of the art, you should be able to define the clinical background, define the standard of care, define the alternative treatments. It should be the benefits and the risks of your device should be put into perspective with the state of the art on the specific disease, and that can also entail discussing if the benefits outweigh the benefits of alternative methods. So if you have a device that is actually not producing any benefit compared to standard of care devices, then actually you have a problem. Even if it is a safe device and you have no risks, then it's, again, there can be a positive outlook on the benefit risk ratio, but you should meet state-of-the-art standards. And on that point, let me also stress the fact that from our experience now with notified bodies, we see that these, thank you. So these actually, the performance and safety of your device needs to meet the state of the art, and you are expected in the clinical evaluation, when you are presenting the results of your own analysis and your own data, to make actual comparisons and to draw conclusions on that. Okay. So thanks, Jerome. Exactly as pointed out by Ganka, I hope I'm pronouncing this well. You can have a look at MedDev 2.7-1 revision 4, and that, perfect. And that will give you some guidance with respect to the state of the art and the requirements for establishing this. Because the requirements, I assure you, they are quite strict, and they are now under a lot of scrutiny by notified bodies. Okay, so valid clinical association, we covered this point, and we are okay with time, I think. Technical performance and clinical performance, I mean, this is, I think, a lot more straightforward. For demonstrating the technical performance, of course, you would take into consideration the documentation, the technical documentation of the device. You would focus on verification activities, as we said before. For example, that you have demonstrated compliance with applicable standards. If there is a standard for, I don't know, I don't think there is a specific standard for diabetic retinopathy diagnosis, but there might be a standard on that. For example, if it is detection of heart arrhythmias, it's likely that you will find the standard. So you need to demonstrate compliance with applicable standards, technical standards. You need to show that you're using also process standards, such as the ISO 62304. You need to discuss the fact that you are implementing a QMS, that you have a list of standards that are being respected. And then in this verification activities, for example, for AI specific applications, what we discussed before with someone from you, I don't remember who it was, but for cross-validation, for example, this is a part of the verification of the system, right? So you're developing your system, and during this development phase, maybe you are using cross-validation to check the performance of your system before going into the actual validation with external data. So this is actually a part of the verification activities, and if not the verification, it would be definitely part of the development activities and of good practices during the software development. Sometimes there might be some specific ISO that might be helpful. This is correct. This is correct. And keep in mind also the harmonized standards by the EC. Precisely. Verification of the device's intended use, compliance with standards. So intended use, I think intended use, it falls more into the validation, validating that for its intended use, the device is performing clinically correct. So it would be more verification that the device has been developed as should be, and that it complies with the various standards, that it meets certain thresholds for performance, etc. I mean, this is something that you look with clinical evaluation. So exactly, for clinical performance, you might leverage clinical data coming from maybe clinical investigations, usability studies, very important, regulatory standards again, usability studies. So and that's a big one for AI. Yeah? We have been saying this all of this time, and we will say it one more time: usability. They make sure that the user is actually able to understand what is happening, and and they're able to interact with your AI. You need to cover the intended population, user environment, etc. So the clinical performance demonstration for the IDXDR, it's something that you can actually also check, because if you go into the FDA website and you go into the technical file, the approval letter from the FDA, there you can have like a short summary of the evidence that have been provided to the FDA during the clearance, during the process of approval. And there you will be able to find actually the clinical data that were used for the by the IDXDR for getting the approval. And I have this as an annex to the presentation. I mean, in case we do have time to see it, I'm not sure. But in case we do have time to see it, we will discuss what sort of evidence they provided to get the clearance in terms of clinical performance. Okay, so I think now it's quite clear how the standard works. If you do not mind, I will continue with the questions a bit later on. Let's move on a bit with the presentation. For the clinical evaluation, potential sources of data that you may consider are, first of all, the state of the art, as we discussed. This is particularly important for demonstrating the valid clinical association you cannot use data from similar devices really as pivotal data to demonstrate compliance, but as we said, they can offer some sort of like comparative threshold as to what state-of-the-art performance is. You have sources of data that are preclinical, that would include verification activities, compliance with applicable standards, etc., and usability data. And then for clinical data, you may have, in general, for the clinical evaluation, you may have data coming from clinical investigations, data coming from the literature on the device or its equivalent device. And then you may have PMS data, data that are post-market surveillance data, data that are collected after the approval of your device, after the CE marking, and that might be data regarding key performance indicators, your KPIs that might cover complaints, trends in sales, etc., and incidents that are reported in national databases. Now, I think this was also discussed yesterday by Gustavo, so I'm not going to stay here, but keep in mind for the data that you're using, both for training and for validation, that GDPR is followed, and basically that the requirements for good data, general data protection requirement regulation is followed. I mean, it's very important to make sure that you have the consent of patients for using the data, that you're following the correct procedures with respect to anonymization or encryption, that the data is lawful and it's fair and transparent, the processing has been done, etc. So basically, to summarize and to offer maybe some of, I would say, some maybe personal thoughts on validation and in light of what we have discussed for the legal framework. I would say some key points to consider for the validation of AI, including what we have discussed so far, but particularly with an emphasis on dataset quality and quantity, sources of bias for your AI. That's one point. We will see this again. We will summarize some important aspects, and we will discuss maybe some practical approaches to it. The second point that, in my opinion, is very important, and we see it coming from both the US and the EU, there is this emphasis on the clinical workflow around AI and the interaction between the human and the AI. So this is something you definitely need to consider in the validation, during the validation of your AI. And then finally, I think it is rather obvious that transparency and explainability are 2 points that you need to address within your clinical evaluation. So for dataset quality and quantity, keep in mind, as we just said, GDPR. Just because you find some data in a database, I don't know, in a publicly open database, that does not mean that you can use them to develop a medical device software or to validate it. Make sure that they meet the GDPR. Of course, there is this concept in software engineering, if you have like garbage in, garbage out. So if you have data that is of poor quality, this is going to be reflected in your model. Make sure that there are proper data labeling practices that are followed. So if you are the one who is actually gathering the data, make sure that there is a very transparent and a very robust way for data labeling, because if you don't have a correct reference, we saw this before, right? If your reference is not correct, then you cannot demonstrate basically the performance of your device. And also for the reference, keep in mind what is also the clinical practice and what data could be actually considered as real gold standard. So I think these are some very important points on data quality. And then there is a question on that, actually. There are quite a few questions as well above. Fabienne, can you specify when ethical approval is needed to perform studies, at least in Switzerland? This needs to be considered based on Human Research Act. So basically, whenever you have an investigational device, there you need to have proper ethical approval and the approval of the competent authority. So if you are gathering data, you need ethical approval. And if you're using data that have been collected by a third source, make sure that ethical approval has been provided, and that your data is actually taken by informed consent. And then interpretability and explainability. Are there any established and accepted methods, such as Shapley values? So there, we'll discuss this point shortly. I'm going to get back to you on this question. I will get back to this point. So for data quantity now, how much data is enough for training? This isn't really a question of validation. This is more a question of verification. But how much data is enough to say that you have, let's say, properly trained your model, and how much data is enough for validating your model? So to respond to this question, I would first separate between the two. In my view, validation is actually something a lot more straightforward in terms of data quantity. So you have a specific system that is, let's say, that for the diagnosis of a disease, and you have some thresholds for what an acceptable performance might be. There are statistical methods that you can employ to reverse engineer and to find out what data set size would be sufficient for validating your model. For training, this is a different type of question, and I'm sure that most of you have faced this issue of asking yourselves, okay, how much data is enough, and when do I actually stop the training, and when do I get when am I satisfied with the performance of the model? There is not a straightforward answer to this question. I mean, it is some, I would say, personal work to figure out, some analysis to figure out where your device, where your AI currently stands. I mean, with respect to dataset training, dataset size, you have to consider the complexity of the model. You have to consider, okay, how many classes does your model have? How many inputs? How many features does it take as input? You need to look into the state of the art, right? You need to know if you can see what other models are or other publications are considering sufficient. There is, in my opinion, there is always interest in looking into the learning curves and basically evaluating how the data set size for the training affects the model skill. I mean, from there you can understand, you can already have some basic input into the training data set size, as well as potential problems of overfitting, underfitting, bias, variance, etc. And then it is not only about, having more data, but also take into account the quality of the data during this evaluation. So maybe if the quality of the data is not sufficient, then the training is actually not worth pursuing. Maybe the problem starts from very, very early on, and that's why you don't have a good performance in your AI. There is a question from Michael. If I wish to develop AI for software as medical device, is it necessary to prototype experiment on a QMS with design controls and documentations, or can that come later? When is that move to a formal QMS appropriate? Okay, so we get this question very often. I would say, especially for software, provided that you have the IC 62304 that discusses QMS and the importance of QMS throughout this process of development and the total product life cycle, the sooner the better. I mean, it's something to maybe also personalize. I think it's a person, like a device specific question, but the sooner you're able to implement some a QMS and to follow the IC 62304, which requires risk analysis in a QMS, the better. Okay. So data quality and quantity. Sources of bias, we have already discussed this. Be very attentive during the validation and the development of your model, so during both training and validation, to make sure that your data are representative of the target population, that they cover the intended use. As we said before, test sets should be different than training sets, and ideally pursue multi-site data sources. I mean, there is, I have put here also a table from a paper that was published in Nature showing they were basically developing if I remember well, a radiology AI system, and they were showing, using some open source databases, that you have this cross-site performance that varies significantly. So you might be introducing serious bias into your model by just using one single source. You can think of an example. For example, this we said before for heart, the heart arrhythmia AI, right? That was using auscultation. Imagine that you're training a model from data that come from one center, and in this specific center, there is always a background noise because of, I don't know what. It's high likely that there will be some artifacts. So what if your AI in the end builds on the fact that it is able to recognize the background noise rather than the actual, heart arrhythmia? So having multiple sites, data sources that cover multiple sites, is definitely a way to have a more robust validation of your system. And also think of the potential sources of bias coming from the equipment that is used to collect data. I mean, this is not so much of a problem, because if you have a system that has been trained and validated using data coming from a specific machine, like in the example, the IDXDR that we saw before, that is working with Fundus images, they actually said that in terms of compatibility, we are working with this specific camera, and that's it. But I mean, this is something that you need to take into consideration. Maybe you need to have a specific system working with your AI. Or if you want to prove that it works with any system, then that is something you need to demonstrate with your validation. AI and human interaction, we have discussed this. Keep in mind that you cannot know, honestly, if the software, if the AI that you are including into the workflow is going to improve anything before knowing very well the process. So we have the Gasparov law, right? If you have a weak human, so like no expertise, a machine, and a good process, then you're able to beat a strong human with a weaker and inferior process. And there, actually, there is one example of a software medical device that alerts physicians when a patient has actually some physiologic instability. Let's say that your AI was working in a specific way and now you have improved it. And how do you have improved it? Now it provides, let's say, alerts to the physician, but before the patient starts having symptoms of instability. Let's say it's now smarter and it's able to recognize in advance that the person will enter the a phase of instability. I mean, it sounds great and it's an improvement, but practically it might not be. It might actually have worse performance in a real world setup. Why? Because maybe now the doctors will see that when there is the alarm, the patient is fine, and maybe they will just disregard it and they will learn not to trust it. So the process is key, and therefore you need very robust human factors engineering, and you need usability studies that thoroughly cover the intended purpose, the intended user, and the intended use environment of the device. Consider foreseeable risks. Consider who is using your device. Are you actually going to be training maybe somewhere to use your device, such as is the case for caption guidance, as we said before, or for IDXDR? Is it going to be a trained professional where maybe it's you don't need to have the same sort of is it a trained professional? Is it a lay user, etc.? Which are the conditions? Are you in an ICU where everything is critical, where maybe time is of essence? Or is this AI being incorporated into a clinical workflow that's a lot more, let's say, relaxed and receptive to decisions being taken with, let's say, under a relaxed state? This is going to definitely affect the way your AI will interact with humans. And then think of the interface as well. In view of who is using your device, your interface should be as user-friendly as possible. So human factors engineering actually should be integrated from very early on in the design process. Take this into consideration. I mean, it is part also of the process standard, right, of IEC 623. User requirements. Make sure to have a solid basis for your user requirements prior to going into the finalization of your product. Then a final point on transparency and explainability, and we had the question on that before. So to summarize what we have seen so far, it's not just sufficient for the doctors and the patients to have information only on the results, so if the person has, I don't know, this disease or not, but it is very important that they understand which features and characteristics these results are based upon, and to understand the underlying assumptions. So the idea here is that you want to have a system that is transparent and explainable. And here you might say it's very logical to say, sure, but there are some systems that by definition are black boxes. I mean, neural networks, how do you go about the explainability of such models? And there are two levels that you may consider with respect to the explainability of your system. I will get back to your questions soon. So the two levels of explainability. First, it needs to be clear how the system arrives at a specific conclusion in general. So what sort of features are important, if feature important rankings, etc. And then at a second level, it needs to be clear how for the specific patient, for the specific individual prediction, features have been taken into consideration. So what is for this prediction the feature that had the most importance? And that is important for safe checking, for checking for false predictions, essentially. So take-home messages. The regulatory framework around AI, it's rapidly evolving around us. There is some discussion on this topic, and there is the promise that soon we will have very concrete guidance on how to go about it. Already there is some preliminary guidance with respect to the clinical evaluation of software as medical device, which you need to follow, taking into consideration the valid clinical association, technical performance, and clinical performance. It seems that we are converging towards a predetermined change control plan for AI machine learning based software as medical devices. And I mean, there is, again, no formal guidance. And as I explained, it seems that the FDA is already accepting this up to some point. However, we don't have something concrete at hand at the time. Emphasis on trust, transparency, explainability, and the human factors. So human factors engineering interaction between the AI and the human. Then consider from your side good machine learning practices with respect to what is an acceptable model, what is the correct, what is the appropriate data quality and quantity to eliminate bias and to make sure that from a technical standpoint your device works properly and it is thoroughly validated, taking into consideration the intended use and the target population. So like this, basically we're concluding this presentation and we have 4 minutes left to discuss some of your questions that are remaining. I want first of all to thank you for your attention and your, intense participation. I see there are quite some questions and I'm very happy to see that. And we have still at the end of this presentation 160 people that are around. I'm very happy to see that. So Ganka is asking, is there an example of data being... Yeah, sorry, I have to do this. Yeah. Is there an example of data being not representative of the target population? Let's say I would like to have my AI system applicable for everyone. What needs to be considered, e.g. race, sex, or maybe something else? So, I mean, this is an extension of what we were discussing before. Take into consideration the state of the art. Take into consideration confounders. For the example of IDXDR, if in the state of the art it is clearly said that race is an important factor, which I think it actually is, then you are expected to have thorough validation for this point. So the state of the art is the very first point, that starting point to guide you with respect to validation. And then, I mean, your target population sometimes is also shaped from the state of the art. You're able to see maybe contraindications for your device. So that would basically justify keeping, you're validating your device for only a subpart. But as we said, in the case of the FDA, make sure that you are covering the entire demographics of the country. So my brief answer to this would be take into consideration the state of the art, and that should guide you with respect to who you should include during the validation of your device. Also, it is very interesting always, because we have access into the FDA database and we can see similar devices, right? We can see the data they have that they have provided in terms of their clinical validation. I think that is a very good guidance. So if you take a predicate device, what have they actually used? For Europe, it's not as clear, but it's all a matter of justification. Okay. Could you recommend certain existing guidelines for software as medical device post-market surveillance? The MTR is quite vague on PMS. This is correct. I mean, your point is very correct. And I would say that you would start first by, I would start first by thinking of all of the parameters that are of importance with respect to performance and safety. So your KPIs is definitely a part of your PMS. Sales. So you are you want likely to monitor your sales and to explain them, to include them into your clinical evaluation. And why would you do that? Because the complaints that you get, which is also part of the PMS, should be put into perspective with your sales. So it is very interesting to have an idea of the rates of complaints you have per sales. So that is also a part of the PMS. Specifically for software as medical device, you're expected to follow closely bugs, any technical issues with your software, so especially complaints with your software or your own conclusions regarding bugs and software malfunctions. Then the necessity for PMCF studies, this is something that you can, you have to basically evaluate within the clinical evaluation process. And there is a guidance, there is the MEDEF 2.12-2 that you can follow. And then within your PMS plan, also you will have to take into consideration, you will have to be monitoring updates into standards, you will have to be monitoring the literature, the state of the art on the topic, you will have to be monitoring incident report databases. So basically all sources of information, both internal and external, that can affect the performance and safety of your device. I think this covers quite broadly the activities that can be found within the PMS. Okay, that was the question by Bart, and then Ganka basically said that I have the same question, and to add more, what is usually expected to be followed up in the post-market phase? So basically this is what we just, followed up, you mean what sort of indices, right? So I think this actually covers this question as well. We are 2 minutes over time, but I'm going to try to go through all of your questions because I don't think there's much left. Thank you all for your very, very nice feedback. A general guideline for PMS would be the ISO 20416. Perfect. Thank you all. Is there any question actually unanswered right now? So for validation and verification, I saw that Linda also provided some inputs, which is highly appreciated. So verification, confirmation by examination, and provision of objective evidence that output meets input requirements. And then validation is the establishment by objective evidence that specifications, specified requirements, conform with user needs and intended uses. So thanks, Linda. I think this actually addressed, Michael's question. So that is actually done as well. Some discussion on verification. Okay, so there was a question by Enea. There are scenarios in which gold standard is a blurred concept, as medical doctors have different opinions and would reach different conclusion diagnosis when presented with the same data. How do we establish gold standard when there is this sort of blurry situation? Okay, it's a very good question. First answer, look into guidelines, look into what medical societies, recognized international medical societies say about the topic. If there is like a definite gold standard, for example, this person has, well, I'm not a medical doctor, so I'm not very sure, but if I remember well, for some diseases, which disease was that? Like radiography is the gold standard method for assessing, if I remember well, a gastric dysmotility. So this is something that is, for example, acknowledged in the medical society. This is something you will find in your state of the art. You will identify it, and then it's done. This is the reference. And if you don't want to use this gold standard, or you can't use this gold standard, you have to have very strong argumentation as to why not. Now, for some other diseases, for example, for eye diseases like glaucoma, as far as I know, there is no definite gold standard, and there you're in the gray zone. And your question is very pertinent there. So what do you do in these blurry situations? The acceptable approach, to my understanding and to what I have seen from the applications that have been approved by the FDA and by the EU, is to have an expert panel. So in the case, for example, of IDXDR for diabetic retinopathy, because indeed you don't have a gold standard method, but you have actually a validation that incorporates various tests and a diagnostic process that incorporates various tests. There, they used an expert panel comprised of maybe 3, 4, 5 experts, and then the diagnosis is the reference is given according to the expert opinion. So that is an acceptable way to go about it. I think there are actually no questions left unanswered, if I'm not mistaken, and I don't want to take up more of your time. Everything I see. So the one from Enea we discussed. All of this is actually discussed, except for the very first question, which was not clear to me. I don't know if we had any feedback. Yeah. Is model part of the device or only parameters extracted from the model? This question was asked by Stefan, still not clear to me. I don't think that it was clarified, so if you do not mind, I will leave it unanswered. And I think we have covered now all topics. So I want to thank you very much for your kind patience and your active participation throughout this presentation. It was honestly a pleasure. I mean, it's a very interesting topic for me personally. I think the fact that so many of you are here today goes to show that it is a topic that will remain of relevance in the years to come. Thank you in general for your participation in the webinar. It was a great pleasure for us to host it for you. So as discussed, you will receive, I think Linda will take care of it, to send you a quiz to all of the participants, and once you respond to this quiz, you will be given a certification, like certificates of participation, and you will also be given access to the slides, the material that we have prepared for you. A final note on the free regulatory checkup. If you're interested in that, don't forget to email me. It's a first come, first served basis. So the sooner you decide to contact us, the better. And from my side, I have, I think, covered all points. I don't know if Linda would like to say something as a closing note.
No, thanks everyone for participation, and do not hesitate to reach out to us if you have further questions. And thanks a lot, Stamatia, for today's presentation.
Thank you. Great. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Goodbye.